So, good morning, everyone. I'd like to start this keynote by thanking Kelly Wilder, Professor of the History of Photography at De Montfort University in Leicester, for proposing me, and to Lee Gleason, Director of Collections here at UCR Arts, and then for extending the invitation to me. Thank you. I hope I can deliver on both of their expectations. So when Lee first contacted me, I started thinking about what I could talk about around the overall theme of camera-centered histories. At the time, I'd just been to a talk from a well-known photographer who got asked the one question that most dread hearing, and that's, what camera do you use? Other than repetition, the premise behind the question is that it is the camera rather than the photographer that makes the picture. For the photographer, this sets aside their skill, eye, and creativity. But there is also an argument that in some ways the camera or lens can influence how their photograph looks. And that's what underpins this presentation. So my career and personal research interests have been focused on the camera, photographic technology, and the business of photography during the 19th and 20th centuries. I could have presented on some straightforward research, picking out any number of aspects in each of these areas. I jotted down a few ideas, and to be frank, none of them really quite resonated with me. However, with deadlines looming, an idea began to coalesce and everything started to come together. When Lee shared the titles of some of the paper proposals, it made sense to bring together some broader ideas which might help contextualize the papers being presented here today, and to try and set out my own views as to why the camera matters. That phrase became part of the title of my paper. What I intend to do over the next 50 minutes or so, or 40 minutes perhaps, is to look at how past historians of photography have approached the camera, look at the camera in institutional collecting and exhibitions, and to explore why I believe the camera is more than simply a tool to create photographs. I'll then conclude by looking at what is happening now and where photography might go from here. I'll be happy to take questions, obviously, at the end of the presentation. If one looks at the early histories of photography, the camera was generally ignored. Its predecessor, the camera obscura, is usually mentioned, but the camera itself is used for photography is generally overlooked. An example is Robert Hunt in his Manual of Photography from 1854. The first part is focused on a chronology of the developments in photography, and those are concentrated on the chemical advances and process developments, and a familiar roll call of names from Wedgwood, Niepce, Daguerre, Talbot, up to the then recent albumen and collodion processes. His general summary runs across nearly 5 pages and is exclusively focused on chemical developments. The camera only comes into the book when Hunt notes, quote, "A great variety of these instruments have been introduced to the notice of students of the art." And the only references to the camera that might set it into some wider context is a note about the expense, quote, "Many of them so expensive that they are beyond the reach of the humble student." And one further reference to designs that render the camera portable. Hunt notes that the object of this chapter has been to enumerate those pieces of apparatus only which are necessary for an amateur to make his rudimentary experiments. The next history is Gaston Tissandier's second edition of his History and Handbook of Photography from 1878, which was edited and expanded on by the photographer John Thompson. It too was similarly circumspect. In a reference to daguerreotype fever, recording the announcement of the daguerreotype process, it notes, quote, "The opticians made experiments and exposed cameras and the necessary apparatus for taking daguerreotypes in their shop windows." It's not until Tissandier moved on from the history of the book to the handbook that the camera gets a mention. It's brief, and Tissandier, although probably more likely John Thompson, states, quote, "The apparatus with which photographs are taken and which take the place of the darkroom is called a camera. It consists of a plain or bellows box at the back, of which is a movable frame of ground glass. The front is furnished with a brass tube containing the lens." More pages are spent describing the lens, which is, as Tissandier says, is the soul of photography. W. Jerome Harrison's A History of Photography from 1888 is the next significant history. and is described as a practical guide and an introduction to photography's latest developments. Again, the historical pages focus on the individuals and chemistry around the various processes. Harrison does, though, make note of the Walcott daguerreotype camera and sets out why it was important. He says, quote, "In order to take portraits more rapidly, devised a camera with a concave mirror instead of the lens." 10 years later, and almost 60 years after photography was announced, Alfred T. Story's The Story of Photography begins to challenge this narrative. His history is simple and descriptive. Chapter 7 is titled The Camera and Lenses and opens with the phrase, "Step by step, with the progress of photographic chemistry, went on the development of the camera." Story identified the various parts of the camera, but goes on to discuss how they had changed over from the earliest days. The body, in which the earliest days was often made out of a cigar box and a spectacle lens, has developed into a somewhat more complicated affair. He discusses means of focusing, the incorporation of bellows, and the need to produce lighter and more portable cameras through various folding designs. The dark slide moved from holding a single plate to two. Adjustments such as the swing back or side swing, and a similar adjustments to the front standard. He further notes that the various additions to the modern camera, however, had not been applied without reference to some distinct need, and they should not be slighted. William Shepperley's History from 1930 is a more technical book and provides an overview of the development of the camera, but provides little information about the photographs. Lucia Maholi's 100 Years of Photography from 1839 focuses on the wider aesthetic and cultural impact of photography and ignores the camera almost completely, with the exception of the Kodak and its impact on amateur photography. Eric Stenger's The March of Photography from 1950 carries some 12 pages on the camera and equipment and sets out particular designs. He notes innumerable forms and shapes of camera intended for the particular requirements of individual photographers or suited for some special purpose made their appearance, and it seems impossible to give an account of them with any definite and intelligent history or chronology of their appearance. A quick recap of some technical developments, and then Stenger notes, quote, "It is readily understood that the active and constantly growing ranks of amateur photographers ought to take pictures unobserved without the annoyance of a gaping crowd. The makers of photographic cameras sought to meet the demands of amateurs by constructing a small and lighter model, which required no tripod." Stenger then looks at detective cameras, miniature cameras, and automatic cameras in more detail, but no reference to the photographs. So this then was the general line taken by most photography histories, whether they were intent on focusing on the histories of the aesthetics of photography or trying to be an all-encompassing history of photography. Newhall, Gernsheim, Frisot, and more recent histories from Hacking and others treat all of these tend to focus on the art of photography or the impact of the medium through key names, dates, photographs, and a setting within art history. Hacking, in her telling of the whole story of photography, does at least note the camera with the Kodak and the Brownie within the context of popular photography. So much for these histories of photography. There is a counterpoint to this narrative which started in 1965, but does not really gain traction until the mid-1970s. In 1965, Chiltern Books and Photo published Harry Gross's Antique and Classic Cameras, which provided a history of photography set around the camera and photographs that a collector could expect to find. It was based around Gross's own collection. There was a slight lull then, but in part driven by a growing collector's market for cameras and photography. The 1970s saw the publication of various histories, catalogues, and checklists of cameras, particularly those publications from Michel Auer based on his own collections. In 1974, Ted Holmes's An Age of Cameras, and in 1975, Reg Smith's Antique Cameras appeared, both of which provided a history of the camera up to around the 1890s. The key publication for any history of the camera is Brian Coe's Cameras from Daguerreotype to Instant Pictures from 1978, which provides a detailed history of the camera up to the date of its publication and still provides the best technical history of the camera, at least for analog photography. It did what Stenger had said 30 years earlier was impossible by giving an intelligent history and chronology of their appearance. By the end of the 1980s, the first price guides of cameras appeared, epitomized by Jim and Joan McCown's Price Guide to Collectible Cameras. The 1980s also saw the growth of collectors researching and publishing on particular marks. Inevitably, perhaps, the Leica was the first and gave rise to many similar titles, and others appeared on Zeiss Econ, Nikon, Kodak, Anthony, and many others, mainly promoted by a small number of niche publishers or self-published in Britain, France, and in the United States. There were country-based catalogues of cameras from France, Hungary, Spain, Italy, and elsewhere. There were also attempts to publish more themed histories of 35mm reflex and stereoscopic cameras. This plethora of books has declined from the early 2000s, reflecting a wider decline in the number of collectors and consequently a more limited market for such books, although there have been some notable exceptions, not least my own publication, A History of Photography in 50 Cameras, which uses key cameras as jumping off points to look at broader themes within photography. So, stepping back from this chronology, I can see two turning points. Firstly, histories of photography in the post-war period moved away from what were often chemistry-based histories, usually written by photographers or those involved with photographic science and in some way. I'd suggest that this change was a result of some distance in time from the early history of photography and a consequence of historians and curators being better able to identify broader themes within photography that gave rise to a greater historical perspective on the history of the medium. I'd also accept that the concept of a so-called definitive or all-encompassing history of photography is now an outdated one. It's also clear that as the 20th century drew to a close, the idea of histories of photography and more specialist approaches began to dominate. Secondly, the growth of the art market for photographs and a parallel market for photographic collectibles, mainly cameras, gave a new impetus for publications looking at their respective histories. In parallel to collectors' books, there was also a rapid expansion in books dealing with the history of the photograph, although general histories and especially monographs on individual photographers and time periods or themes prevailed. These two strands, though, rarely overlapped, and it was rare that historians brought the technology into the photograph history, and similarly, those writing about cameras and photographic technology rarely made mention of the photographs that the camera was designed to produce. It's this dichotomy which lies at the heart of this paper. I want to turn now to the second part of this paper, institutional collecting and exhibitions, and how they have dealt with the issue of the photograph and the camera. I'm going to use examples of British collections as I know these best, but I am of course aware that there are collections such as those at George Eastman Museum, the Smithsonian, and the Harry Ransom Center at Austin, which have actively collected or at least acquired both images and photographic technology, and of course this illustrious organization that we're part of today. But I would argue that these are exceptions to the norm. In the case of the Harry Ransom, 700 items of photographic technology are flagged on their website as accession, but, quote, unprocessed, suggesting that they have a lower priority than the photographs. And in general, all these institutions tend to exhibit photographs and technology separately rather than integrating them into one display. In Britain, the first museum to collect photographs was the South Kensington Museum in London, which became the Victoria and Albert Museum. The V&A had a specific remit around art and design and collected photographs showing works of art, sculpture, and decorative arts, and these are now being reassessed as photographs in their own right. And it also collected photographs as works of art and as an artistic medium. So, for example, Sir Henry Cole, the director of the museum, purchased directly photographs from Julia Margaret Cameron, and these entered into the collection. However, it was not until 1972 that a photography department was established and a curator of photographs appointed. The counterpoint to this was the Science Museum, which was established in a form that we would recognize today in 1909, although its origins too went back to 1851. It focused on the science of photography, chemistry, optics, and technical developments only, collecting photographs as examples of process. Other museums generally fit into the Science Museum or Art Museum categories, although in the later 1970s and 1980s, there were a number of private museums that contextualized cameras alongside the photographs they produced. The Kodak Museum, which was established in 1927, did collect images as well as equipment, although it too, and it did this as part of a way to tell a broader history of photography, but the images were generally secondary to the equipment. This separation of equipment and the photograph is also apparent in exhibitions. These generally concentrate on images by a photographer or period. Cameras and photographic technology have been shown alongside other exhibits in photography exhibitions or on occasion as objects of design in their own right. For example, London's Design Museum, in a retrospective of the work of the industrial designer Kenneth Grange, showed a number of his cameras that he designed for Kodak Limited, alongside his other design work, which ranged from household objects to the London taxi. I think there are a number of reasons why this situation came about. At one level, it lies with photography itself and the debate about whether it is an art or science, and rarely has it been seen that it can be both. This is exacerbated by how photography has been collected and shown institutionally. Even in major expositions such as the 1851 Great Exhibition or 1862 International Exhibition, photography was shown in two classes, as an art or graphic medium and as a technology. The major art institutions had no interest in collecting photographic hardware, and similarly museums of science or design which collected cameras and technology only saw the images as an example of process. This lack of interest in cameras and photographic equipment has also meant that the cameras associated with particular individuals have generally been lost. Although where there have been exhibitions on, for example, Cameron or Hill and Adamson, then their respective lenses have usually been shown, and occasionally other provenance equipment or sometimes of a type associated with an individual will be shown alongside their photographs. I can think of recent shows of the work of Paul Strand, Don McCullin, and Robert Capa where this was done. This lack of institutional willingness to broaden collections has reinforced this barrier, but in the United Kingdom, there have been exceptions. In 1983, the National Museum of Photography, Film and Television was established in Bradford. It brought together the Science Museum collection and acquired other collections privately and individual objects at auction. And the Kodak Museum collection was transferred to it in 1985. With these in place, it was uniquely placed to be able to tell a broader history of photography, which it did from its opening. The museum collections were further supplemented with the addition of the Royal Photographic Society collection in 2003, which added some 10,000 further cameras and pieces of equipment, 250,000 photographs, and a library of some 20,000 books. The by then renamed National Media Museum was well placed to show cameras alongside photographs, which it did successfully in its permanent galleries and in some of its temporary thematic shows. The transfer of the RPS collection to the V&A Museum in 2017 provided an opportunity for it to do the same for the first time. The RPS collection supplemented the museum's existing photograph collections with cameras and photographic equipment. At a workshop the museum held, which brought together individuals from education and museums to brainstorm how it might best make use of the RPS collection, I advocated very strongly that the cameras and equipment provided the museum with a unique opportunity to tell broader stories of photography that integrated both the art and science of photography in a way that the V&A had not been previously able to do, albeit in a museum of art and design. Some of the displays since then in the V&A's Photography Centre, opened post the RPS acquisition, have made some attempt at doing this, most successfully with the first historical display, which used some of the RPS's cameras, from Scott Archer and Talbot, alongside their photographs and amateur box cameras. But the cameras are mainly seen alone and separate from the photographs by the public in a eye-catching display just outside the entrance to the photography galleries. I've been consulted by the V&A recently on the second phase of its new photography centre, which will open next year and will bring selected landmark cameras to the fore alongside the images that they made. I think what's interesting is that the private collectors that turned to photography in the 1970s often had a broader perspective on their subject than the institutions, which, as I've described, were much more constrained by their own histories and collecting policies. In those early auctions at Christie's and Sotheby's from 1971, the cameras and photographs were initially together in a single catalogue, and there was less of a separation which came along during the 1980s. Some of the collectors buying during that period were interested in both, perhaps from one perspective, but they bought across both areas. So, for example, Fred Spira formed an extensive collection of cameras, but included daguerreotypes and other photographs, as well as photographically illustrated books and stereographs. Leif Preuss in Norway collected across photography, and in London, private collectors such as Cyril Permert, Bernard Howth Looms, and others brought both cameras, stereoscopes, and photographs. What tends to link these collectors is that they started their collections with the intention of creating private museums that could tell a broad history of photography based on objects. And they're also collecting, perhaps in this very early period, for the interest in photographic history, when perhaps some of the demarcations were less ingrained. In Spira's case, his collection is now in a climate-controlled store in Qatar. Preuss's collection now forms the Norwegian National Museum of Photography, although it remains known as the Preuss Museum. And Bernard Howth Looms is at the National Museums of Scotland. Others have been dispersed at auction or privately. In the United States, Matt Eisenberg started with a general collection of cameras and photographs before specializing in daguerreotypy, and ranged across both the hardware and the daguerreotype image. Jack Naylor near Boston likewise collected across both, although his collection was mainly focused on cameras. Unlike Spira, Preuss, or Eisenberg and others, most collectors have, of course, tended to collect either cameras or photographs, a particular type of camera, Leica or Kodak, for example, or a particular type of photograph, stereoscopy, or a period, or simply just a photographer. So to sum up, with a few exceptions, which were usually the result of particular reasons, most institutional collections of photography have tended to collect either cameras or photographs, and this has been reflected in their permanent galleries and exhibitions, which have rarely crossed boundaries to bring both sides of the medium together. In the previous two sections, I've tried to give a summary of how historians and institutions have treated the camera in the history of photography, and largely overlooked bringing the technology to sit alongside the photograph. Well, you might turn around and say, actually, it doesn't really matter, that the two are very different and they sit comfortably apart. If so, I've hopefully got the remainder of my time to convince you otherwise. Throughout my career and in much of my writing, I've argued that the technology and business of photography should not be seen separate from the photographs they produced. One cannot properly understand and fully understand one without the other. There's a symbiosis between the camera and the photograph that should not be ignored. Of course, this isn't true for every history of photography or for every collection, but I do struggle to think of examples where they might not be improved by adding context. I'm not going to concentrate too much on the business of photography here, although the business of the camera, its manufacture and marketing, and the companies that were formed to make and sell products are part of this wider story. So I will give a little bit of background. In photography's early period, up to say the 1870s, the camera was mainly made by philosophical or optical instrument makers, and for some historians, its origins lay there. For historians of science, the camera is not considered part of their canon of instruments, except occasionally as a recording tool. While early camera manufacture can be situated with instrument makers, what differentiates the camera from scientific instruments, I would argue, such as microscopes, telescopes, theodolites, etc., is that these instruments had two main purposes. They were either used for measuring or they were tools for observing. The camera really was neither of these. It was designed as a tool to produce something else, a photograph, an artwork, or a record of something. Although camera manufacturing continued to be situated in the optical industries, it was only a matter of a few years before camera manufacturing started to be taken on by firms or individuals that specialized in photography. Although it was a long time before scientific instrument businesses left photography completely. So let's look at changes in manufacturing. As with a lot of history, changes do not happen neatly, and there's more of a transition. But in general terms, in the 19th century, Britain and elsewhere, local craftsmen dominated the camera manufacturing and traditionally made cameras, as we'll see with Larry later on today. With increasing mechanization from the 1870s, camera manufacturing expanded to meet a growing professional and amateur demand. The Birmingham firm of J. Lancaster and Son grew to mass producing cameras through outsourcing production and assembly. And by 1901 was advertising it had sold over 275,000 cameras and 300,000 lenses. With the advent of a more systemic factory manufacturing, new fabrication techniques and new materials, not least a shift from polished mahogany to metal, cardboards, and later plastics, camera design evolved to reflect this, and production at scale for the mass amateur market started in the United States, Britain, and Europe. The second period was that of the German industry, which from the early 1900s and especially from the 1920s to 1960s dominated the precision camera market. In the early period, names such as Voigtlander, Huttig, Ernemann, Ika, and others were mass producing and exporting precision-made cameras. In 1926, a number of these firms joined together to form the Zeiss Econ Combine, and elsewhere in Germany there were firms such as E-Lights, Ihagi, Franke and Heidecker, Nagel, and others. After the Second World War, the rapid growth of the Japanese industry, with its lower manufacturing costs, new manufacturing methods, gradually overtook the German industry. It began by initially copying German products before moving ahead with its own innovative products and with an increasing amount of electronics being integrated into mechanical cameras. The German industry simply could not compete with this and began a process of consolidation, with the great firms of Zeiss Econ, Voigtlander eventually joining together in 1972 and eventually moving away from camera manufacturing completely. More recently, the Japanese camera industry has seen consolidation and revision, and the larger electronic groups with better R&D and capital, as exemplified by Sony, have refocused consumer demand on mirrorless cameras. Traditional manufacturers such as Nikon and Canon are still trying to reinvent their photographic camera business. And some of the well-known brands from the post-1945 period, such as Olympus, Minolta, Pentax, and others, have disappeared or been subsumed. That chronology is quite simplistic, but it provides a framework with which to work. And if one drills into the detail and separates the snapshotter from the amateur market and the serious amateur professional market, then there are certainly variances. Countries such as the United States, of course, maintained a manufacturing capacity from the 1840s through firms such as E&HT Anthony, Ansco, and Eastman Kodak, alongside a number of smaller manufacturers creating more specialist products. So what does this all mean for photographs? As I argue in my PhD thesis, which examined British photographic manufacturing and retailing from 1839 to 1914, there was a tension and linkage between the supply of cameras and photographic equipment and the demand from the consumer, i.e. the photographer or snapshotter. There's a debate to be had whether manufacturers were responding to the demands of consumers or whether photographers were simply taking up new products to support their picture making. That's something for another time, but whichever was driving that change, the outcomes manifested themselves in different ways for different markets. So what are some of these trends? A move from larger cameras to smaller. This is a trend that applies equally to the professional and amateur photographer. For the professional, standard studio practice for serious work moved from whole plates to half plates, then to 5x4 inch plates, and later cut film. For some works, such as carte de visite portraits, of course, this doesn't change, but the general trend reflects a lower cost associated with smaller plates, improved emulsions, and later the ability to enlarge successfully, especially from the 1870s. Even if the studio camera size didn't vary very much, as it didn't need to, the type of plate holder could be made smaller, helping the economics of the studio photographer. For amateurs, the introduction of dry plates, more sensitive emulsions, and again, the ability to enlarge negatives to make exhibition prints from the 1880s and 1890s reduced the typical plate size from whole plate to half and again to 5/4 and quarter plates. The smaller camera and shift from collodion to dry plate supported the expansion of amateur photography, as we all know, and did this in a dramatic form. And coupled with a professional class and working class looking for pursuits to take advantage of with increased leisure time. The growth of the Photographic Club is another manifestation of this. For the photograph, I think there was a general trend to smaller prints in exhibitions as amateurs still contact printed from their negatives. Evidence is hard to find as size is rarely given in contemporary catalogues across the period from 1860 to 1920. But from rare pictures of exhibitions in situ, this does seem to be the general case, although again, enlarging became more prevalent post-1900. What may not be immediately apparent is that small cameras with their smaller negative size gave rise to new designs of lenses, which in turn by the 1890s were underpinned by new optical glasses and new methods of calculating optical design, moving away from empiricism. Ross and Dalmayer in Britain, Zeiss in Germany especially, introduced a number of new lens designs in the 1890s, which gave photographers new opportunities with wide-angle lenses, sharper lenses, and wider aperture lenses suitable for low-light photography. Some of these supported the differential focus propagated by Emerson and taken up by the later pictorialists. Two examples. Julia Margaret Cameron's use of a Dalmayer lens gave her portraits a particular look with their very shallow depth of focus and was a direct, and I would argue, and I think many would argue, a deliberate decision to take advantage of the characteristics of that lens. The work of Fred Hollanday and the use of the Pinkham and Smith soft focus lens, which was eminently suited to his pictorialist work, is another example. Hollanday also introduced Alvin Langdon Coburn to a British soft focus lens, probably the Dalmayer Berkheim in 1896, and in 1896, and its use is apparent in Coburn's photography from this period. Another aspect of the changes in camera design is the position from where the camera was supported to make photographs. Earlier on, for larger format cameras or in particular conditions, the camera was always mounted on a tripod, and although adjustable within certain limits, remained at a fairly consistent height. With the introduction of more portable cameras, often termed hand or detective cameras from the 1880s, the position of where photographs could be taken was shifted. For cameras with a reflecting viewfinder, this would be at waist level. Later on, the position shifted to eye level as single lens reflex cameras became the norm for certain types of photography. Today, as we know, a camera is frequently held at arm's length, facing backwards towards the photographer, or at eye level facing outwards. What this means for the photograph is that unless the photography consciously shifts their personal position, then the typical position for the taking of a picture has moved upwards. But this same portability, reduced size and lower weight also allowed the camera to be dropped to ground level, taken aloft on an aircraft and used in non-traditional positions, all with their impact on the photograph. The other impact was of smaller portable cameras was the informality that was introduced to photography. This was particularly the case for snapshotters with physically smaller cameras, which could be taken to beaches, parties, and social occasions, and used in unplanned ways, or certainly less planned ways. True snapshotting, the taking of pictures unobserved and taking of pictures of others in unguarded moments, entered vernacular photography. The size of the camera was one factor which was further supported by other technical changes. More sensitive films, cartridge loading, integrated flash for low light, fixed or simple focusing, and increased automation from the 1930s. For the amateur, this started a general trend for fewer opportunities to make classic photographic mistakes, although it didn't eradicate them completely. Even with digital or smartphone photography, mistakes can still happen when the camera's technology is pushed outside of certain parameters. For other areas of photography, such as fashion, the shift from the late 1950s and 1960s from traditional studio cameras to medium format and 35mm allowed for a new way of photographing within the studio environment and outside, introducing informality and spontaneity. Another factor I think which gets overlooked is the shift from the ability to able to make a single exposure with the daguerreotype or a small number of exposures at one go with the calotype, collodion or dry plate processes. The introduction of stripping film and then more conventional celluloid film from the later 1880s with their longer lengths has, I think, been overlooked, although we heard perhaps a little bit about that earlier on today. The original Kodak with its 100 exposure capacity was a bit of an aberration, but the ability to take 8, 12, later 36 exposures on certain film stocks meant that the need to approach photography more slowly to ensure a result first time could be dispensed with. Making a small series of exposures meant that the best, however one defines that, could be chosen from a contact sheet. For the amateur, the glass plate and cut film continued to hold a sway, but came at the cost of weight and bulk. The advantage of film and cut film meant that the photographer could come back with more exposures. For photojournalists, of course, being able to load a cassette with 36 exposures ensured that fewer shots would be missed and reloading kept to a minimum. Today, of course, digital photography has almost removed this constraint with memory cards that will hold thousands of images. A more significant impact on the photograph is format. This is most evident in specialist applications such as panoramic photographs, of course, or stereo pairs where the camera can, but not always, determine the appearance of the photograph. The aspect ratio is something that has varied across photography. The 3:2 ratio of 35mm has particularly influenced the photograph, with some photographers always choosing to print their negatives full frame. But the 5:4 large format negative influenced the print, with the 10x8 paper remaining a common size and again allowing the full negative to be printed. Contact printing a negative established standard paper sizes, although the prevalence of enlarging diameters from the 1890s, 1900 period meant that cropping in the darkroom under the enlarger removed the direct link to the film format that had been more prevalent in snapshot and amateur photography from the 1890s. That said, though, even in the 1960s, up to the 1960s, my parents used a 127 roll film Brownie 44A, which produced square negatives, and the prints which came back from the local chemist were also square, albeit enlarged. That 1:1 format, square negatives of the Rolleiflex and many other cameras proved popular and could even be contact printed. The square print continues to be popular, even if it does not always derive from a 2¼ inch or 6 centimeter square roll film negative. Today, that classic 3:2 screen format, including that of PowerPoint presentations, is now giving way to the 16:9 HD ratio. For other areas of photography, the best example of the impact of the camera on the photograph being made is photojournalism, which was, of course, revolutionized by the introduction of the Leica and Contax cameras and their use of 35mm fine-grained film. Again, portability and smaller cameras coupled with improved, faster and sharper lenses and film stock all supported this shift to smaller cameras and made new types of photography possible. I want to draw some of the foregoing to a conclusion. It's been a bit of a wander around the camera manufacturing and the impact of the camera on the photograph. My starting premise that one cannot fully understand the photograph without an understanding of the camera does, I believe, hold at a general level, and in some cases at a very specific level. However, the picture is a complex one and is not applicable equally across all areas of photography. The changes to the camera, optics, and sensitized materials over time, and the different markets for photography mean that one needs to talk in generalities or start to look at the technology and the resulting photograph in detail. Furthermore, direct causal evidence is often difficult to find, and one may need to make inferences which can bring an inexactitude to any discussion. It is, I believe, for these reasons that historians have paid scant attention to the role of the camera in histories of photography and frequently disregarded its impact on the image. I would encourage historians to give fuller consideration to some of the factors associated with photographic technology that lie behind the photographs and the photographers they're writing about and exhibiting, to help inform a deeper understanding of the work and why it looks like it does. Looking to the future, digital photography continues to involve some of these historical antecedents and continues to impact the image online, on paper, or in print. The now ubiquitous smartphone is further expanding the range of photographs that we capture. Ever present, the historic requirement to think ahead about taking a camera to make a photograph has disappeared. Technically, the smartphone sensor works well in low light, and image stabilization, focus, and digital enhancement are all now standard features. Aspect ratio is simply something that one can dial in from panoramic to standard to widescreen, and 3 or 5 lenses are common to modern smartphones. Sharing online, post-processing can be done on the device, or the image or the file can be downloaded for proper processing or printing via a PC just a few clicks away. But like prints from traditional cameras, there's an impact on the smartphone or digital print or that image on your screen. There are perhaps fewer user errors, or do we simply delete the failures such as the modern equivalent of the thumb over the lens? And technology has eliminated others such as double exposures, blank frames, scratches on the negative, white dust spots, chemical stains, or processing errors. But it has introduced new errors. Digital noise on an image, color fringing, the wandering green dot, false color from incorrect color balance are all new, although perhaps I'll debate the last if anyone here remembers tungsten and daylight balanced film. New types of user errors such as streaking from setting deliberately or automatically too slow a shutter speed and incorrect focus carry over from the historical to the present. Some of these may manifest itself on the print, and instead of grain from silver halide, we now have pixelation from over enlargement or over processing. So to end with, I would like to return to Alfred Story's 1898 comment, quote, "The various additions to the modern camera, however, have not been applied without reference to some distinct need, and they should not be slighted." With which I would extend by saying that they may also directly determine the appearance of the final print or image on screen. I want to show one example of where the camera and the lens have had a direct impact on the photograph, just to end with a picture, and quote New York's Museum of Modern Art. It says, "Bill Brandt began a long exploration of the female nude, transforming the body through the angle and frame of the camera lens. Like many other examples, Brandt's distinctive photographs only exist because of the camera." Thank you.
All right, hi. Thank you, that was wonderful. Shuffling around to check the Zoom here. Rob says, many years ago, the George Eastman Museum removed their wonderful permanent display dedicated to the history of camera technology to repurpose the space for other museum functions like expanding the cafe and bookstore. Do you find this reduced interest in displaying camera technology by institutions to be widespread, worldwide, and if so, why? And I'm happy to comment about us along the way, too.
I'll let you talk about UCR. I think often with institutions, it can be down to the individual curators that maybe have an interest, and I think increasingly commercial opportunities perhaps play their part as well. And I remember that Eastman display, which I think was called the Mies Gallery from memory. It was a long time ago, I think. But that was a wonderful display, and yeah, I suspect I think it's I'd be hard pushed to say there's a trend there, but it's a shame when it happens, because I do take that view that we should be showing both the image and the camera together.
And we had done similarly here. We'd had a permanent gallery for a long time that had a camera, largely camera display with some photographs, but the cameras were very much unchanging, and obviously the photos had to change now and then. And we ended up disbanding that about 4 or 5 years ago, and doing temporary exhibitions, which sometimes include cameras or focus on cameras like the current one. But you know, we have also been another plot point in that same trend. So for us, I think staffing is certainly part of it. I mean, we know internally, sort of anecdotally, that we get a lot of people who ask about our camera collections. We get a lot of people who are wearing a camera around their neck, which obviously is an increasingly rare thing to be doing in life in general these days. So we get people who care about the gear, and we just haven't always prioritized exhibiting it in the same way. I'm guarded in some of my word choices here, knowing that I've been serving as our executive director in an interim capacity for the last 6 months. But yeah, I think it's certainly something that our institution has talked about and thought about and such. So I see Bella has her hand up. Yeah.
Thank you for wonderful keynote. It was just to continue that conversation, really. I wonder whether it's because the general population is not so camera literate as it is visually literate, if it's appropriate to divide those things up. I think, you know, those displays, those museum displays that have a huge amount of cameras in them make a lot of sense to the collector and the enthusiast and the serious photographer, because they can understand the technology in front of them and read it without a great deal of contextual information in a way that many people who are not collectors, enthusiasts, and serious photographers cannot. Whereas an image can be read in a number of different ways by somebody with absolutely no training. So that's just my kind of contention. What do you think about it?
Well, I think in some ways, though, that comes back to what I've sort of tried to argue, perhaps not done as well as I could have done. But I think that camera illiteracy of the public is actually the very reason why the camera should be shown against or with or alongside the photograph, because you know, how some of those photographs looks, and that Bill Brandt example, of course, is perhaps an obvious example, but how that photograph look is absolutely dependent on the camera. And you know, whether it's through format, size, whatever it happens to be, then, you know, by showing the two together, actually our public, that, you know, museum curators and others are trying to educate or show or help show them sort of that history, and actually show them what today's contemporary photographers are doing and how they're doing it. Actually showing the equipment they're using helps that process, I would argue.
There's a lot of comments. I also wanted to throw in, we as a university museum, knowing that the typical undergraduate is born in this century now and is a full digital native, showing that history of technology is, I think, much more jarring to a younger generation to see. And it's something that I certainly have taken to heart. I'd seen Britt's hand up before Meg, if that's okay.
Hey, thanks for such a great talk. I was wondering if you could maybe reflect a little bit on the around this issue, the difference between film studies and the Cinematheque model of both history and display. It seems to me the latter, that film history and Cinematheque model of institution has a sort of a different openness to apparatus. And I mean, starting even conceptually with the ideas around apparatus theory, but perhaps because an apparatus is used not just for production, but also exhibition display of the final product, the film. Might that be part of that? And are there ideas that could be kind of ported over from the film and Cinematheque model? And just anecdotally, some years ago, LACMA hosted an exhibition about Stanley Kubrick that had been created in a Cinematheque. And to this day, people of of all different backgrounds come to me and say, I just love the cameras they had on display and very prominently in one of the introductory galleries. So just to bring up, I'm sure you've had thoughts about this and would love to hear them.
It's a really good point, and it's not something I had thought about. And just thinking off the cuff here, I think with film displays, I think it's almost about the difficulty of showing the media. Or traditionally, it was always much more difficult to show the software, the moving image alongside the equipment, although that's changed obviously with digital technologies and screens and everything. But the Cinematheque, or even the cinematography gallery in the Old Science Museum in London, they didn't show any films, but they had some wonderful displays of the movie cameras and the equipment to set the pre-cinema, and then the projection and the cameras that they showed. So I think they had to show the equipment because it was the only way they could convey what the moving image was about. Now that has changed, and I haven't been to the Cinematheque recently. I don't know what the American Museum of the Moving Image is doing at the moment with their displays, whether they've updated it and been able to integrate the software with the hardware. But it's a really, really interesting point, and that certainly, I think, needs a bit more looking at.
Meg, please.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I think I'm following up a little bit on Bella's point about general literacy of non-camera users. And as an artist, I'm interested in, I always want to push back against the technology mattering too much on the same, but also I'm completely obsessed with the technology. But I sort of challenge, does it matter to have a camera as a camera type in broad strokes is emblematic of how that technology was deployed, or is it the exact camera? Because good luck to any curator to figure out what camera I used 20 years ago. I can't remember, right? Which of 10 cameras I had available to me I might have picked up at that time. When I was in this collection, and I'll speak more to this, but when I was in this collection, there are cameras where the photographer etched into the metal on cameras and left their mark on the camera. And there are cameras that are cranky cameras and cameras that are compliant cameras. So I guess I wonder at what point the individual camera matters, or if it's really a question of sort of the literacy approximation of what style of camera was used.
I think I might sit on the fence here and say actually it could be a bit of both. I think there's an opportunity for any forward-thinking institution to start collecting cameras that have a provenance to them, so that they can tell some of that bigger story. And of course, not every exhibition would probably benefit, although maybe, I don't know, I think they perhaps could do. But I think showing the camera alongside the photograph is important. I think you're right. It doesn't have to necessarily be the exact same, but because students are only really, a lot of students are only used to their smartphone, or that's their camera now, then I think it will help them understand, maybe, why viewpoints were chosen, why things are certain sizes. And so it doesn't need to be the exact same. And when I give talks to students now, I have to explain what a negative and a positive is. And that really hit me quite hard when I started to have to do that, because students studying photography at degree level haven't grown up with a darkroom. They don't understand that relationship between a negative and a positive. And so, photography is changing, and I think it's sort of incumbent on us to help them understand where it's come from. I think what was interesting was that Paul Strand exhibition, to see the equipment that Strand was using certainly in his early pictorialist phase, and then when he became doing more sort of straight photography, actually that helped me understand his approaches to some of his work. And I think that's all I'm asking really, is that curators should give some consideration where it's possible to do so, and of course it won't be possible with every example, every photographer, every exhibition, but seems to me there should be an opportunity to do that, or maybe it's done through a talk or a workshop or something, maybe not necessarily in the exhibition gallery.
Nikolai.
Yeah, I had a question kind of related to that. So one of the things that happened with smartphones too is this kind of flattening of, the device itself contains the film stock, the lens, and everything. And so much of the story of photography is the specific film stock used and the lens combination. And sort of what strategies have you found effective in kind of communicating that history, specifically maybe to students, and sort of how, again, this flattening happened, and sort of where we are now, where everything is sort of in one container, so to speak.
I have to say it's not something that I've actually had to sort of contend with. I think any institution that's dealing with native-born digital images clearly should be dealing with that and trying to understand that. But I say on a personal level, it's not something I've yet had to do because the students we get in, we're sort of working with them in a slightly different way. But it's certainly something that needs looking at if you're dealing with say native-born digital. Absolutely.
There's a few questions on Zoom that I wanted to get to. So Jennifer Tucker had asked, tying into some of our recent questions, I think it ties well. She asks, are there other practices beyond exhibition where the history of camera processes and manufacture are interpreted, such as workshops, theater, other?
I'm just thinking about that, Jennifer. That's a good question. I think the short answer is I don't know, and it's a good question, and I ought to know, and I'm struggling with that one slightly. So I think we might have to speak offline on that one.
I mean, one that comes to mind for me in Southern California is for a long time, a photographer, practicing photographer, Luther Gerlach, was doing demonstrations at the Getty where he had a giant large format camera and he would do tintype or he would do wet collodion, or just let people look through a big view camera. And so there was more of an interactive, maybe not fully hands-on, but an interactive component that was existing as sort of an educational program. But I think these things are few and far between and might be a luxury that only places like the Getty can truly afford. So a couple other questions on Zoom. Hi, Rose. She asks, do you think that any camera has been particularly influential in the long history of photography since 1839?
Yes, I mean, of course, there are the obvious examples. Obviously the Kodak, the Leica. Those are the ones that are quoted. That they do make Maholi's book and some of those other histories, and they're perhaps the obvious examples. I suppose I'd like to choose something. If I had to pick out something, I think I would choose something like perhaps the Rolleicord, the Rolleiflex, just because it's a bit different, and I think they had an equally important impact on photography in terms of the square format, but also for again for press and other types of sort of photography genres. Yeah, I mean, actually, again, things like the Exacta, again, I think it gets a bit left behind with the Leica and the Contax camera, but the Exacta actually was one of those cameras that you see in enormous numbers. So they were clearly selling to a really strong market. There was a good demand for them at the time, and certainly post Second World War. Again, the Exactas perhaps were more affordable, so they tended to sell in large numbers. I think you need to read my book. Read my book, Rose.
There's 50 in there.
Yeah.
And one more on Zoom. Katharina says, one short question. Is there a connection between the European, is it DIN or DIN format, paper format, and camera image formats of the early 20th century, thinking of Walter Portsman?
So again, that's a really good question. It's not something I've done any research on, but I think there's it's one of those little side projects, particularly on plate formats, that is something I need to work on at some point. But I'm quite interested in how plate sizes and formats evolved and developed, and why certain formats were the sizes of them evolved, and then obviously that can have I think has an impact on paper sizes. I mean, that relationship, 10 by 8 paper I quoted in the paper there, I think there's something there, but I don't know the detailed answer on that one. I think there's all these different avenues that one needs to spend some time with, but standardization anyway for photography starts to come in from the 1880s, 1890s, and I'm sure that would have been reflected through some of the international standards for film and paper. Quite when that started to happen, I'm not totally aware of.
That's great. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please. We'll get you the mic.
It just dawned on me that we hadn't really looked at or discussed stereo. And I was thinking that stereo had a lot of people in the early stages didn't go out and buy stereo cameras, but they certainly bought the, what is it, StereoCon, and the images for that, what do they call it? Armchair travelers. I just curious about that because it hadn't been mentioned in really tonight.
Yes. So, I mean, obviously the ways that one could make stereo could either be with a single lens camera or a twin, two lenses on a camera. So there, that's the practical side of making a stereo pair. I mean, how that the standard format came about. I'm not sure. I suspect it would have been probably the most effective way of dividing down a standard plate or to get those two images onto it. And then why the later 45 by 107 millimeter size came about. Again, I don't know the detail, but I suspect that someone literally slit a larger film, and that was the size that it came down to. But again, I think there's questions there that need to be answered probably more with some more research behind them. But
yeah, Cynthia.
Well, this is not to complain about your removing the collection, but
Oh, you're welcome to.
Yeah. Okay. And so I'll just simply reveal that I actually worked at the CMP in the 1990s. Okay. And the primary visitor of that collection was about 10 to 11 years old because it was the most popular with children. Okay. And that's where so many of the museum tours happened. And, that mentioned before that cell phone photography and it's all sort of enclosed. Well, most of those kids, the only camera that they really knew was the camera that you bought in the drugstore that was preloaded with film and that was brought to Disneyland. And so they had no real idea. And the kids were the ones that were completely into it, looking through the stereography, bringing out various things, and maybe some of them perhaps not the most appropriate archival techniques ever. We'll just forget about that. And I wonder if, I don't know that you still get, like the kids' tours.
So, I mean, that's more of maybe an institutional discussion we could have over lunch, but Lindsay is our educator. And so she is very much focused more, we're grades 8 through 12 these days, or 7 through 12. But we can certainly talk more about that. It is interesting. And I've occasionally had, not for a few years now, like way pre-pandemic, but like apparently there's a Girl Scouts photography badge, and like they could come in and learn about cameras from us. And so there were paths of engagement with those age groups that maybe we need to revisit too. We'll see.
I think it's a really good point, because actually we at the RPS in Bristol, we've just put on a display of cameras which tells the story of the camera from 1840, pretty much just about to the beginning of digital. And I think we probably get about 3 types of visitor. There's perhaps the slightly older visitor that is able to relate to some of those later cameras, particularly from the 50s and 60s. So there's a nostalgia element there, and they engage with that part of the display. But what's interesting is that the school children and the university students, they really engage with that whole display because they don't have any understanding directly, unless their parents were photographers. So they don't really understand, a 1950s Leica, and certainly not an 1850s collodion camera. And we find that they spend an awfully long time looking at that display. And at the moment it's still in course of arrangement, so we haven't got labels on it, but yet they're still looking at the cameras. They're talking amongst themselves, they're taking pictures of it, they're doing selfies of themselves with the cameras behind them. So I do think there's I think we do young people a disservice if we think they're not interested, because they seem to be interested in that historic technology. And I'm sure it applies across the field of audio and music and in all sorts of other technologies as well, that there is an engagement there. They're interested in it. Some of them might only look at it once and think about it, but they are interested, and some of them seem to come back, and we've got a small handling collection of cameras as well, so they start to play with a box camera and look through the viewfinder at waist level, pick up a Leica and put it up here, and start to understand how they could use that camera, or how the camera was used. And some of them actually engage, university is starting to a lot of them are now going back to film photography and having to buy some of that equipment that some of us got rid of in the early 2000s. So I think there is an interest there, and I think we do a disservice if we think they're not interested in it. So there's definitely an audience out there for the technology.
I think that's all we have time for a Q&A.